Hi everyone, let's be here today. I gave a little brief introduction to myself earlier, but I'm going to go into a little bit more detail now. So my name's Caius and I'm a technical lead at ThoughtWorks. I specialise in the area of health and social care. At the moment I'm working with the NHS on patient record management within primary care. But I've been with ThoughtWorks for around 3 years now, but what I'm actually here to talk to you today about is my experience prior to ThoughtWorks, where I spent the best part of 10 years working in the area of serious games and extended reality technology. So before I get into the structure of this talk, I just wanted to very briefly touch on what exactly extended reality is. And that's really for anyone in the audience that might not be so familiar with the term. Now, extended reality, or XR, can be described as an immersive technology. And really, it's evolving. It's an evolving technology. So these definitions as well are evolving. But for the purpose of this talk, I'm going to define it in this way. So firstly, we have virtual reality, which I'm sure most people in the room and virtually are very familiar with, which is really the use of head-mounted displays, wearables, and other haptics to fully immerse a user within a virtual environment or virtual content. Then we've got augmented reality, which is the use of smart devices, so things like iPads, and you're augmenting content onto the real world, and you're getting a little bit of a magic window effect around the content. And then lastly, you have mixed reality, which, as the name suggests, is a little bit of a combination of both augmented reality and virtual reality. So again, this is the use of head-mounted displays, but you really get a sense that those objects are in the room with you and a real sense of presence. So this and all forms of extended reality have some really powerful applications. So this talk is going to be broken down into 3 main sections. Firstly, I'm going to be telling you about a project that I'm particularly passionate about and spent around 3 years working on, and that's called xploro. And then I'm going to be talking about some of the technology. So I'm going to be looking at some of the building blocks that make this technology possible. And this really is to frame some of the challenges and considerations in the final section of this talk. And I'm going to be using xploro as a bit of a lens to talk about some of those challenges. So when my friend's daughter Izzy was just 13 years old, she was diagnosed with a rare cancer called Ewing sarcoma. Now, Izzy's in her 20s and is thankfully cancer-free. But during her treatment, no one really told her what to expect. And that understandably left her feeling alone, anxious, and really afraid. And this was primarily down to the fact that there was very little information that was geared towards Izzy at her age to help understand the procedures, the treatments, even her condition. The information that was there was more geared towards adults and her parents. And when she had time with consultations with consultants or doctors, they would often gear their conversation towards her parents. And that left Izzy feeling quite left out of that conversation. So unfortunately, Izzy's experience is not unique. So that led Dom and his team really to build a health information platform called xploro. And the main aim of xploro is to basically provide these young patients with a way to understand their conditions, the sort of treatments that they might face and procedures they might be having. And that's really to empower and engage them. And ultimately, that's going to be reducing their fear and anxiety and hopefully improving their clinical outcome as well. So the way in which xploro approaches this is by breaking this problem down or using 3 main mechanisms, if you like. So the first is gameplay. Gameplay runs throughout xploro. So really gameplays are used as a way to introduce them to different treatments, get them used to the environments they might be in, even teach them about their condition in certain ways. And another important aspect of the gameplay is it encourages them to open up to the care team and the care professionals that are working with them. And that gives them an opportunity to personalize treatment towards that young patient. The second area is artificial intelligence. And this is really through the use of a natural language chatbot. So this chatbot's been built in a way that uses synthetic phonics. So clinical terms can be broken down into phonemes. And the young patients can misspell those words, but still get the answers they're looking for. Typing in things like chemotherapy is not an easy word to spell if you're a young patient, but you can still get an answer if you're looking for a question, if you're looking to find out more about it. And on top of that, they can use their voice as well to ask questions. And then lastly, we have extended reality, which is obviously what I'm going to tell you a little bit more about today. So for anyone in the audience or virtually who's ever had to have an MRI scan before, I'm sure you'd agree that it's quite a frightening experience, really. It's very claustrophobic. There's lots of banging and thumping as the magnetic resonance spins up. And, as an adult, it's frightening. But as a young patient or child, it's absolutely terrifying. And really what xploro allows them to do is experience what it's like to have an MRI scan in a safe space, to get used to that sense of scale, get used to that space they're going to be in, hear the sounds they might hear, And more importantly, it gives them a sense of the level of control they have over that situation. So in most hospitals, people can choose to listen to music whilst they're having the scan, or they can have a mirror mounted above their head so they can see their parents behind a protective screen. And all this really builds towards reducing that fear and anxiety in that young patient. Really increases the chances that they're going to cooperate with that scan. So if they move during the scan, we have to redo it, and it puts them through that ordeal again. And on top of that, it has a health economics impact as well, having to redo that scan. So xploro allows them to, hopefully reduce its stat in these young patients. So it was part of a clinical trial, and this was run by Dr. Lucy Bray at Edgehill University. And in this trial, there was 80 young patients, all going for cancer treatment. And 40 of those patients received standard care for their cancer. And another 40 had xploro as an intervention. And really the headline finding from this clinical trial was that there was a statistically significant reduction in procedural anxiety in the patients that had xploro, this type of intervention. And I think unrelated studies looked at the relationship between fear and anxiety and a reduction in fear and anxiety and how that improves clinical outcomes and responses to treatments. So personally, I find it absolutely amazing that this sort of technology has the power to potentially improve the clinical outcome of those young patients as well. So it wouldn't really be possible without the help of experts and subject matter expertise. And those experts are aged between 8 and 15. And their openness and honesty about what they went through was absolutely amazing. And it's really helped to shape the content and the types of experience that xploro is delivering to those other patients. Some of which have been to hospital with cancer treatment, and some of which represent children that have never been to hospital before, and those sorts of patients that might be using it for the very first time. But each had really interesting insights that were fed into and co-designed as part of this, part of xploro. Personally, I was very struck when I was speaking to an 8-year-old girl and she was telling me quite openly all about her fear and experience of loss of bladder control when she was going through treatment. And, that really struck me because it's not a difficult thing to talk about. So the fact that she was so open and honest about it, because she really wanted to make sure that other young patients didn't have the same fear and anxiety that she experienced. So she wanted to make sure that was part of the app and that information was there for them. So today, xploro is in a number of different countries around the world, and it's helping hundreds of young patients. They just recently partnered with World Child Cancer as well, and that's going to allow them to expand to 4 more countries as well and hopefully help hundreds more patients. I know the team are also looking at other conditions outside of just cancer treatment, and also content for those that are affected around as well. So content for siblings, for example, to help them understand what their sibling might be going through if they're going through cancer treatment. So that's a little bit of an introduction to xploro and the really positive impact that's having for young patients worldwide. I'm now going to go into talking a little bit about technology, and this is going to be a little bit of a deep dive, but I think it really helps to frame some of the challenges in the final section of this talk. So I'd like to take you through some of that now. So in all extended reality, we're really trying to answer a fundamental question, and the question is, where is this device in 3D space? And the reason we want to know this is because we want to be able to move a virtual camera within a virtual environment or render virtual content around that user. And this is otherwise known as pose estimation. So to do this, we need to use the device's sensing capabilities. And the first capability we can use is something called the Inertial Measurement Unit, or IMU. And the IMU is responsible for 3 things, really. It measures the angular rate, which is kind of the rotation of that device or that head-mounted display. You have the transitional velocity or the positional changes in that device. And then you have orientation, which is really the compass direction of that device. And it does this because it's made up of 3 sub-sensors. So you have a gyroscope, which is giving you that rotation. You have the accelerometer, which is giving you those positional changes or velocity changes. And you have the magnetometer, which is giving you that compass direction. So an IMU in itself gives you a way to estimate the pose of a device, but we can't rely on this alone. And that's really down to the fact that there's small errors in those readings that build up and compound over time. And it would end up with quite a disorientating experience if we just use the IMU as a way to move that virtual camera in that virtual environment. An analogy for this is imagine you're sat in a shopping cart and you've got a blindfold on. It's a little bit of a strange situation to find yourself in. But if someone's pushing you around in that trolley, you probably start off with pretty good guesses about where you're going, forward, backwards, left and right. But over time, errors in your own sensing capability would start to build up, and you take your blindfold off and you'd be in a completely different place to where you're expecting. And this is kind of why the IMU is not on its own enough to be able to estimate pose. So we had to use yet one more sensing capability, and that's known as visual odometry. And really, this uses the device's camera as a sensor, as a type of sensor. And cameras see the world in frames. So if we take a single frame that we pick up from the camera, we're looking for feature points in this frame. So we can use some computer vision algorithms to do this, one of which is called the fast corner detection. And a simple way of describing this is it just looks for high contrast pixels in that image. And then for a given radius around those pixels, it looks for some contiguous pixels. And this helps find features within that frame. So if you imagine we have a frame, we have some feature points, we then take the next frame we get from the camera. We do exactly the same process. So we have a previous frame and a current frame, and we have feature points in both that we can try to track from one frame to another. And you can imagine you're moving this device around, and as you're doing that, those feature points are moving as well in 2D space. They're moving about. So we can start to get a bit of a picture of the world around us from this. The next step really is to say, okay, we have a set of feature points. And really, we have these, they're pixel positions. They're in 2D space. So we need to be able to firstly unwarp them, and then we can use a mathematical model known as the pinhole camera model, and that allows us to put those points into 3D space. So it gives us an idea of the world around us. And as we're going, we're starting to build a bit of an image of the world. So as you can see here, this is kind of sensing the world and sort of understanding the objects that we have in front of us. And this is really creating something that we call a point cloud. And so you're moving this device around, you're looking at the world objects around you, and that point cloud is transitioning, it's rotating, it's changing. In kind of simplified terms, if you reverse those movements of that point cloud, you really are estimating where the camera is moving and how the camera is being affected by that. So if you take these two things, you put them together, you get a technique known as spatial localization and mapping, or SLAM for short. And it looks a little bit like this. It's kind of sensing the world and getting an idea where that camera is. So as a really quick recap, we've got the IMU, which is giving us an estimation of pose. And we're also using odometry as a way to sense the world. Those together are giving us something known as SLAM. And that, in turn, is giving us a way to accurately estimate a device's pose. And again, this is to move the virtual camera within the virtual environment. So that was a little kind of deep dive into some of the technical foundations and building blocks that make it possible. I'm now going to talk a little bit about the challenges in implementation and rollout of this type of technology within the healthcare value chain. So that kind of process that I described can be reframed as a bit of a feedback cycle. So you've got a headset where you've got a device that's collecting information or data around the world, about the world around it. That's been fed into a model, which is estimating a pose. Again, that's moving a virtual camera. And that whole process starts again as the user starts to explore that space or that experience in that world. And what we find from this is that it takes a bit of time to build up enough data to make sure that experience is stable. So if I take xploro as an example, a lot of those young patients are going through rounds of chemotherapy and they're experiencing a level of nausea. The last thing we want to do is use this sort of technology and enhance that feeling of nausea or exaggerate it in any way. So we have to really make sure that we have a stable experience before we're able to use it as a way to interact with them. And one approach that we took with xploro was really to gamify the problem. So we took a 2D, in 2D space, we showed a balloon to the user. So yeah, we don't have enough data to do anything in 3D space at this point, but we can certainly display images on the screen. And it gave the impression that that balloon was floating around in front of them, and being kind of inquisitive as they are, they would chase it around until the point where we had enough data, the balloon would burst and the experience would start. And this was really effective in this particular use case. But I think it's important to understand that this level of building up the stability and onboarding data has to be considered in other use cases as well. And obviously, chasing a balloon might not be appropriate for all. So. Very much related to this is the type of environment that you're using this technology in. So on the left-hand side, we've got a very typical clinical space, a waiting room. We've got lots of bright walls, lots of light bouncing around. And the visual odometry really struggles with this. You can't find feature points within this kind of environment very well. And then you've got Royal Manchester Children's Hospital, and you've got the waiting room there. And that's very feature rich. It's got a lot of bright colors, a lot of patterns. So this makes for a really good place to use the tech in. But we don't want to be confined to just using it within a waiting room. Otherwise, it's not going to get the best use out of it. So as a consideration is where you're going to be deploying this tech. So moving on to kind of the impacts for the user, simulator sickness is something that really only really affects the user head-mounted displays. But it's quite hard to describe as it manifests itself differently in different people. But there's a few models which try to describe the effects of simulator sickness, and the first of these is the neural mismatch model. This describes simulator sickness as discrepancies between the contents in your neural store and your body's present movement. So in other words, what your brain expects your body to be doing doesn't match up. And then we've got the postural instability theory, which describes it as the long-lasting postural instability, so long-lasting ability to balance. And the most vivid example of this really is seasickness. And then last model to try and describe simulator sickness, which is really derived to describe motion sickness, was the evolutionary theory. And that simply says that as a species, we haven't yet evolved to a new mode of transport, so our bodies aren't used to it, and we get that sensation of sickness due to that. What we found through developing xploro as well as other products was people's tolerance and degree of simulator sickness would go down over time as they were using this tech more and more. So we found starting off for people that weren't used to it, like the maximum of about 10 minutes was the most that most people could cope with. And then over time, as they're using it a little bit more, they become more and more used to this kind of experience, and that simulator sickness doesn't affect them so widely. Again, sticking with the effects of the users, maintaining the level of immersion is an important factor, especially for this type of digital therapeutics. The last thing we want to do is take someone out of that experience when they're really getting something from it and really working through something, particularly if you look at things like cognitive behavioral therapy. And one thing that can do that is a limitation of the tech at this moment in time, and really that's down to something called the screen door effect. And this is where you start to see the pixels of the screen that's close up to your eyes, and it takes away from that feeling of being in that space. So, it's really a limitation of screen technology. As screens evolve and we get higher pixel densities, that's going to go away. But to be aware of that in today's iteration of the technology is important. Ways to counteract that really is to have engaging content and using other senses as well, like really well-designed sound can keep people engaged within that and ultimately keep their brains believing that they're in that space. When it comes down to testing this technology as well, there's some real challenges there. In traditional software development, we tend to approach things through unit testing. So we have some very well-defined parameters. We put them into some code under test, and then we expect certain results. And we can do that because those parameters are very well-defined. But in this type of real-time technology, you have a lot of complex systems interacting. So you have things like light transport simulations, you have physics simulations. You even have scripted behaviors that developers have said, okay, when I interact with this cube or this object, this is what should happen. And all these things intertwine in quite unique ways. And as a user, it's quite difficult to predict what they're going to do. They have that level of freedom, they have that level of control. And seeing sort of physics simulations they can break in quite dramatic ways and things fly all over the place. That's probably not a great thing to have happen to you if you're experiencing this for the first time. So the paradigm to testing has to be changed a little bit. And we have to think about this in a little bit of a looser way and have thresholds around our tests and say, we expect certain things to happen and not be too prescriptive about that. Now, one of the real big blockers to the proliferation of the technology is around regulations and regulatory authorities. I think that affects a lot of different areas as well and software and a lot of different innovations. The challenge with extended reality is that there's a debate over whether it's classified as a medical device in its own right or whether it's a software as a medical device. And I think to answer this question, we really need to look at where is this technology being used along the healthcare value chain. So as an example, if we're looking at performance improvements, in the case of non-clinical training or warehouse management, there's no direct impact to patient safety. So you probably in that case wouldn't classify it as a medical device, and therefore it wouldn't qualify for those level of regulations. But then when we look at things like digital therapeutics and cognitive behavioral therapy and tools for that, it's definitely working with patients' mental health. So classifying it as medical device would probably be appropriate in those cases. Very much linked to this is around data governance and privacy. And the challenge with this is that effectively we're documenting snapshots of a patient's journey. And all this information can be used to biometrically infer things about that patient. So the sensitivity of this data set is, should be treated at the same level as something like the electronic health record in reality. But as we're seeing this technology in its early stages and it's growing, we need to bring these considerations forward because we've got data sets being captured on the device and different servers. We need to evaluate whether they're secure enough and they're being treated with the same level of regulatory approvals that, say, electronic health record systems would be as well. And I think, keeping with the theme of health record, there's a real opportunity here in terms of interoperability. And if we look at things like the longitudinal health record, how can that be fed into these types of experiences to start to personalize them for any individual patients? But as we look at that, there's obviously even deeper considerations about what regulatory authorities might apply to that. Things like the NICE framework come into play when you start to look at interoperability with electronic health records. So how does that affect this technology, and how does the NICE framework, how fits is it really to be able to look at this from a different angle to traditional software development? And then lastly, around clinical assurance. Clinical assurance processes at the moment, for anyone who's been involved in them, are quite long and arduous processes. They're anywhere from 6 to 18 months. A lot of manual testing. Really, we're trying to build up the confidence of the clinicians. We haven't yet really started to take advantage of automated testing in those sorts of clinical assurance processes, or even automated assurance certification. And until we move towards that world, this sort of innovation and other innovations are really going to struggle to move into this kind of fast feedback cycle and move towards things like continuous delivery. So I think there's a bit of evolution that needs to happen to the clinical assurance processes to start to evaluate how innovative technology is being brought to patients within patients' hands quicker. So I've covered off some of the top level considerations and challenges. I'm not going to go through every single one of these, but just to touch on a few. Things like hardware cost. Obviously, this is an emerging technology, and there's also R&D going into it. And R&D costs typically get pushed onto the consumer. So hardware cost isn't really within the reach of the average person at the moment. Certainly, organizations can afford to bring in devices, but from looking at this from a kind of home point of view or the average consumer point of view, they're not going to be able to take advantage of this at this moment in time. And then capabilities and collaboration as well. To build out this sort of technology, it takes a real combination of complex software development as well as a lot of creative disciplines. And it's the sort of capabilities that you typically find in the games industry. On top of that, we need subject matter expertise, so clinicians that understand the technology and are able to feed into that. And having that kind of group of people together is something that we don't have at this moment in time. So thinking about how do we build centers of excellence, for example, that sort of bring these people together, working on the right problems, trying to solve the right problems. Ethics consideration, as well as accessibility, diversity, and inclusion. So in some ways, extended reality lowers that barrier of accessibility and inclusion. But for some people, it just won't be usable. So how do we think about what the sensible fallbacks? We can't go all in on using this to solve certain problems. How do we allow those people that can't use this tech to benefit from that problem-solving approach? So before I wrap up, I just wanted to give you a little bit of insight into how you can start evaluating this technology for yourselves, or have your team start evaluating this technology. And there's 2 tools I really wanted to highlight. The first is Unity, the Unity engine. This is a real-time games engine it's its original purpose. It's used in a lot of industries now for simulation, like automotive and architectural. It's a really powerful set of tools. Has a bit of a learning curve to it, but out of the box, it has some really powerful extended reality tools. So you don't have to deal with things like pose estimation. That's done for you. You can just focus on trying to solve problems and building content over the top of that. And then on the other hand, we have things like A-Frame, which for teams that are a little bit more familiar with web-based technologies, this is quite an easy platform to start with. So it's an entity component system built in HTML. And out of the box, again, it has all those pose estimation stuff done for you. So you can just get on with trying to prototype things out. So it's a good way to start getting into the technology. So a little bit of recap, but I told you about the real positive impacts xploro is having on young patients around the world, and Izzy's story about how that kind of came about. We had a little look behind the curtain at some of the technology building blocks. And then finally, the challenges and considerations around what's getting this technology out into the healthcare value chain. So thank you very much for listening, and I'd love to take any questions if anyone's got any.